What starts as a quiet day on a Texas farm takes a shocking turn when a farmer encounters a young black woman lying unconscious near his fields. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay with us until the end to uncover the truth behind this unsettling encounter. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. The sun blazed high over the sprawling Texas farmland as Ralph Whitaker adjusted his wide-brimmed hat and squinted into the distance. At 72, he was no stranger to the hard work and isolation that came with managing a farm. His days were predictable, feeding livestock, mending fences, and tending to his crops. It was a life of routine, and he liked it that way. People, in his opinion, only complicated things. The locals in town, however, had their own opinions about Ralph. He rarely showed up at community events, didn't take part in church gatherings, and spoke to neighbors only when absolutely necessary. Over time, this aloofness had transformed into a reputation. Some called him a recluse. Others whispered harsher things, accusing him of harboring racist attitudes. The whispers didn't bother Ralph much. He'd never cared for the opinions of others, but they built a wall between him and the community. It was a wall he had little interest in tearing down. That morning, Ralph had risen early to inspect his northern fields. He walked with a slight limp, a remnant of an old injury, but his stride was steady. The summer heat was already pressing down, but he paid it no mind. As he made his way past the rusted fencing that marked the edge of his property, a strange sight stopped him in his tracks. At first, it was just a splash of color, red against the golden hues of the dry grass. Ralph frowned, adjusting his hat for a better look. Something, or someone, was lying near the edge of the dirt road that cut through his farmland. Narrowing his eyes, he moved closer, his boots kicking up dust with every step. It was a woman, her body sprawled awkwardly in the grass. She was young, probably no more than 25, and dressed in a tight, short red dress that clung to her frame. Her dark skin glistened under the sun, and her hair, curled and slightly disheveled, framed her face. She wasn't moving. Ralph's first instinct was to turn away. His grip tightened on the leather strap of the tool bag slung over his shoulder as unease crept in. What was she doing here, dressed like that, miles from the nearest town? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Maybe she was trouble. Maybe this was some kind of setup. And yet he couldn't ignore the stillness of her body or the faint rise and fall of her chest. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Against his better judgment, he crouched beside her. "Miss?" His voice came out gruff, unpracticed. He reached out and gently shook her shoulder. There was no response. Her face, framed by her tousled hair, was strikingly beautiful, but it was pale and her lips were slightly cracked. Ralph hesitated before pressing 2 fingers to her neck. A weak pulse fluttered beneath his fingertips. She was alive. Looking up and down the deserted road, Ralph considered his options. He could walk away, leave her for someone else to find. But the thought sat heavy in his chest. He might not be the most sociable man, but he wasn't cruel. With a resigned sigh, he slipped an arm under her shoulders and another beneath her knees. She was lighter than he expected, but her head lolled lifelessly against his arm as he lifted her. The walk back to the farmhouse was long and grueling. The sun beat down mercilessly, and his leg throbbed with every step. Sweat dripped down his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he pressed on, determined to get her out of the heat. Inside the house, Ralph laid her on the old couch in the living room, its fabric faded and worn from years of use. He grabbed a damp cloth from the kitchen and dabbed at her forehead, trying to bring some color back to her cheeks. She stirred slightly, a faint moan escaping her lips, but her eyes remained closed. Ralph pulled out his cell phone, his fingers hesitating over the screen. He hadn't called anyone in years, let alone emergency services. With a gruff sigh, he dialed 911 and explained the situation. The operator's voice was calm but efficient, asking for details about her condition and location. Ralph answered as best he could, his words clipped and impatient. "They'll be here soon," he said aloud, though there was no one to hear him. He pulled a chair over and sat down across from the couch, watching the young woman with a mix of suspicion and concern. Who was she? What had happened to her? And why, of all places, had she ended up here? The distant wail of a siren broke the heavy silence. Ralph stood and walked out onto the porch, waving the ambulance down as it pulled into the dirt driveway. 2 paramedics stepped out, one carrying a medical bag and the other pushing a stretcher. "She's inside," Ralph said curtly, stepping aside to let them pass. The paramedics worked quickly, checking her vitals and attaching monitors. Ralph hovered in the background, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He watched as they lifted her onto the stretcher, her head lolling slightly to the side. "She'll need to go to the hospital," one of the paramedics said. "Do you know her name?" "No," Ralph admitted. "Found her by the road, that's all I know." The paramedic nodded, offering a polite but distant smile. "You did the right thing, calling us. She wouldn't have lasted much longer out there." Ralph said nothing, watching as they wheeled her out to the ambulance. The door slammed shut, and the vehicle disappeared down the road, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Standing alone in the silence, Ralph felt an unfamiliar pang of worry. He didn't know this girl, had no reason to care about her, but something about the encounter stuck with him. Shaking his head, he muttered under his breath, "What the hell have I gotten myself into?" He turned and walked back into the house, the image of the girl's lifeless form in that red dress burned into his memory. The day after the ambulance had disappeared down the dirt road, Ralph Whitaker found himself standing by the kitchen sink, staring out at the sunlit fields with a coffee cup clutched in his hand. The image of the girl in the red dress was still vivid in his mind, a sharp contrast against the golden grass where she had been lying. He couldn't shake the thought of her pale, unmoving face or the faint rise and fall of her chest. It wasn't like him to dwell on strangers. His life had always been simple, routine-driven, and largely devoid of the kind of human entanglements that created complications. But this was different. Something about the girl had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite name. He had spent most of the night tossing and turning, haunted by questions he couldn't answer. Who was she? What had happened to her? Why had she been out there alone, dressed like that, miles from the nearest town? None of it made sense. His instincts told him to let it go, to focus on the farm and forget about her. Yet, as the morning hours ticked by, he felt an inexplicable pull to know if she was all right. By mid-afternoon, Ralph couldn't take it anymore. He set down his mug, grabbed his truck keys, and headed out the door. The old pickup rumbled to life as he turned onto the dusty road that led into town. The hospital was a good 30 minutes away, and he spent the drive rehearsing what he might say. Would they even let him see her? What would he tell her if they did? He had no answers, just a gnawing sense of responsibility that refused to be ignored. The hospital parking lot was crowded when he arrived. Ralph found a spot near the back and took his time getting out of the truck. His boots crunched against the asphalt as he made his way to the entrance, the air heavy with the smell of antiseptic and blooming wildflowers from the nearby garden. Inside, the receptionist greeted him with a practiced smile. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm looking for someone," Ralph said, his voice gruff. "A young woman. She was brought in yesterday. Found her by the road." The receptionist's fingers tapped quickly across her keyboard. "Do you know her name?" Ralph hesitated. "No, I didn't get her name. She's young, black, wearing a red dress. That help?" The receptionist's polite demeanor faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. "Let me check. One moment, please." Ralph shifted uncomfortably, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. After a few moments, the receptionist looked up. "She's stable," she said. "Her name's Amelia Harper. She's still in observation, but she's awake. Room 214. Second floor." Ralph nodded, mumbling a quick thank you before heading toward the elevators. The ride to the second floor felt interminable, the hum of the machinery grating against his nerves. When the doors finally opened, he stepped into a quiet corridor lined with identical doors. Room 214 was halfway down the hall. He hesitated outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle. What was he even doing here? He didn't know this girl, and she didn't owe him anything, but the memory of her lifeless form, the weight of her in his arms as he'd carried her to safety, it wouldn't let him walk away. With a resigned sigh, he pushed the door open. Amelia lay propped up in the hospital bed, her skin still pale but her eyes open and alert. She turned her head at the sound of the door, her gaze locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You're the one who found me," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. Ralph nodded, stepping further into the room. "Yeah, you were out cold by the road. Thought you were done for." Amelia managed a faint smile. "Guess I owe you a thank you." "You don't owe me nothing," Ralph said quickly. He looked around the room, his hands twitching at his sides. "Just wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine," she said, though her voice carried a hint of exhaustion. "Doctors said I was dehydrated. Guess I pushed myself too hard." "Pushed yourself?" Ralph frowned. "What were you doing out there? You're lucky no one else came along. Might not have ended so well." Her smile faded and her eyes dropped to her lap. "It's a long story," she murmured. Ralph watched her for a moment, unsure whether to push for answers or leave her in peace. Before he could decide, Amelia spoke again. "I was traveling," she said, "trying to trace my family's history. My car broke down a few miles back and I thought I could walk to the next town. Guess I overestimated myself." Her words were calm, but there was an underlying vulnerability that caught Ralph off guard. He shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, next time, maybe don't try it in the middle of nowhere. You could have died." Amelia looked up at him, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "And yet, here I am, thanks to you." Ralph snorted, a reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Fair enough." They fell into a tentative silence, the tension in the room easing slightly. Ralph glanced around, noting the IV drip and the tray of untouched food on the bedside table. "You need anything?" he asked gruffly. Amelia shook her head. "I'll be fine. The nurses are taking good care of me." Ralph nodded, stepping back toward the door. "All right then. Just wanted to check in. Take care of yourself, okay?" "Wait," Amelia said, stopping him in his tracks. He turned back to see her watching him with an unreadable expression. "Why did you come here? You didn't have to." Ralph hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He didn't have a good answer, not one that made sense anyway. "Didn't feel right, leaving it like that," he said finally. Figured I owed it to you to make sure you were all right." Amelia studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well, thank you for everything." Ralph tipped his hat, then turned and walked out the door. As he made his way back to the elevator, he felt an unfamiliar sense of relief settle over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he'd done something that mattered. The days after Ralph's visit to the hospital passed in a blur of routine, but something had shifted within him. The quiet rhythm of his life no longer felt as comforting as it once had. The fields seemed lonelier, the house more silent. For the first time in years, he found himself distracted by thoughts of someone other than himself. Amelia Harper. Her name lingered in his mind like an echo. Her strength, even in her vulnerability, had left an impression he couldn't shake. Her defiance, her determination, her story, it all tugged at something deep within him. And yet, he didn't reach out again, unsure of what he could possibly offer. It was a late afternoon when the call came. Ralph was fixing the fence at the edge of his property when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He rarely received calls, and the number on the screen was unfamiliar. With a hesitant sigh, he answered, "Hello? Mr. Whitaker?" The voice on the other end was soft but firm. "This is Amelia Harper. I hope I'm not bothering you." Ralph straightened, his heart skipping a beat. "Amelia, how'd you get my number?" "One of the nurses at the hospital mentioned you left your information when you called 911, she explained. "I wasn't sure if I should call, but I wanted to thank you again. And to ask if we could meet." "Meet?" Ralph asked, his voice tinged with surprise. "You all right? Something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong," she assured him. I wanted to talk, in person, if that's okay." Ralph hesitated, his free hand gripping the top of the fence post. He wasn't used to people reaching out to him, let alone someone like Amelia. But the earnestness in her voice left him little room to refuse. "Where?" he asked finally. "There's a diner just outside town," she said. "The Lone Star Cafe. Can we meet there tomorrow around noon?" Ralph nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Yeah, I can do that." "Thank you," she said, a note of relief in her voice. "I'll see you then." The call ended, leaving Ralph standing in the quiet expanse of his fields, wondering what the hell he'd just agreed to. The next day, Ralph pulled into the parking lot of the Lone Star Cafe, his old truck rumbling to a stop beside a row of newer vehicles. The diner was a modest place, its red and white sign faded from years under the relentless Texas sun. Ralph climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel as he adjusted his hat and headed inside. Amelia was already there, sitting in a booth near the window. She looked different, more composed than when he'd last seen her in the hospital. Her hair was neatly styled, and she wore a simple blue blouse and jeans, yet there was still an air of quiet strength about her. She smiled when she saw him, standing to greet him. "Mr. Whitaker, thank you for coming." "Just Ralph," he said gruffly, tipping his hat. "No need for formalities." They sat down, the awkwardness between them palpable. A waitress appeared to take their orders. Coffee for Ralph, iced tea for Amelia, and left them alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching like a taut wire. Finally, Amelia broke it. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, "for what you did. You didn't have to stop, didn't have to call for help, but you did. That means a lot." Ralph shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Did what anyone would have done." "Not everyone," Amelia said quietly. "Not out here." Ralph frowned, her words cutting deeper than he expected. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It's not a secret," she said, her tone calm but firm. The way people look at someone like me out here, the way they assume things. I've dealt with it my whole life. So yeah, you stopping to help, it means something." Ralph stared at her, his mind grappling with her words. He'd spent years avoiding people, shutting himself off from the world. And yet, here she was, confronting him with truths he'd tried to ignore. "I'm not like that," he said finally, though the words felt hollow even to him. Amelia gave him a small, understanding smile. "Maybe not, but I think you've spent a lot of time trying to convince yourself otherwise." Her honesty was disarming, and for the first time, Ralph felt the weight of his own isolation. He wasn't a bad man, he knew that, but he'd allowed himself to become indifferent, to let the world's problems pass him by without a second thought. "What made you want to talk to me?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Because I think there's more to you than what people say," she said simply, "and because I think you've got more to give than you realize." Ralph let out a humorless laugh. "Don't know about that." "I do," Amelia said, her gaze steady. "You saved my life, Ralph. You didn't have to, but you did. That's worth something." The conversation shifted after that, the tension easing as they spoke about lighter things, her travels, his farm, the quirks of small-town life. By the time they parted ways, Ralph felt lighter, as if a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted. As he drove back to the farm, Ralph found himself replaying their conversation in his mind. Amelia's words had struck a chord he couldn't ignore. Maybe it was time to let go of the walls he'd built around himself, to see the world, and the people in it, with new eyes. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change. The sun was setting over the Texas farmland, casting long shadows across the fields as Ralph Whitaker leaned against the worn porch railing of his farmhouse. He'd spent the day repairing fences and tending to the crops, yet his mind wasn't on the work. Instead, it was consumed by thoughts of Amelia Harper. Their meeting at the Lone Star Cafe had left a mark on him, one that he couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, he felt a pull to reconnect with the world outside his self-imposed isolation. A sudden rumble in the distance broke his thoughts. Squinting down the dirt road, he saw a car approaching, its headlights cutting through the dim light. He straightened as the car came to a stop in front of the house, and a familiar figure stepped out. Amelia. She was dressed simply, her smile warm but cautious as she walked toward him. In her hands was a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her voice carrying the easy confidence he'd come to admire. Ralph shook his head, his gruff demeanor softening. "Not at all. Come on up." She climbed the porch steps, handing him the flowers with a shy laugh. "Thought these might brighten the place up a bit." Ralph took them, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks. Don't usually get visitors bringing me flowers." "Maybe you should," she teased, settling into one of the old rocking chairs. He chuckled, placing the bouquet in an empty mason jar on the porch table before joining her. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the sounds of the farm filling the air. The faint hum of crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of the wind in the trees. It was peaceful in a way that words couldn't capture. Finally, Amelia spoke. "I wanted to thank you again, Ralph, not just for saving me, but for taking the time to meet me, to listen. It meant a lot." Ralph nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Didn't do much, just seemed like the right thing to do." "Sometimes that's all it takes," she said softly. doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Her words hung in the air, and Ralph felt the weight of them settle deep in his chest. He'd spent so much of his life avoiding anything that might disrupt his carefully constructed solitude, but meeting Amelia had shown him the cost of that isolation. She'd reminded him of the power of connection, of what it meant to truly see and be seen by another person. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment, his voice hesitant, "about what you said at the diner." She looked at him, her expression curious but patient. "You were right," he admitted, the words feeling strange yet freeing. "I've spent a long time convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that it was easier to just keep to myself. But maybe that's not the kind of life I want to live anymore." Amelia's smile was small but genuine. "It's never too late to change, Ralph." He nodded, the truth of her words settling over him like a bomb. "I don't know where to start, but I reckon I'll figure it out." "You've already started," she said simply, "by letting me in." They sat together until the last rays of sunlight faded, their conversation flowing easily. Amelia shared more about her journey, about the family history she was piecing together and the places she hoped to visit next. Ralph found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years, sharing stories about his wife, his farm, and the life he'd built here. When it was time for Amelia to leave, Ralph walked her to her car. She paused before getting in, looking up at him with a thoughtful expression. "I'll be back through this way in a few months," she said. "Would it be all right if I stopped by?" Ralph nodded, his smile faint but sincere. "You're always welcome here." As she drove away, the taillights disappearing into the night, Ralph felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He turned back toward the house, the wildflowers on the porch table catching his eye. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel lonely. It felt full of possibility. Amelia's visit had planted a seed in him, one that he knew would take time to grow, but for the first time, he was ready to tend to it, to nurture the connections he'd long neglected. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't face it alone. As the stars began to fill the sky, Ralph sat on the porch, a man no longer bound by the walls he'd built. The world was bigger than he'd allowed himself to see, and he was finally ready to be part of it again. And that's how one unexpected encounter changed everything. What do you think about this story? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking stories like this one. Your support means everything.